So the Rwanda policy, as I suppose it's really been become known as, the it's not going to end well. It's probably the best way to describe it, because if you know anything about this type of policy, this was very, very much pushed, not too surprisingly, by Nigel Farage years and years ago. In fact, it was one of the very core things he started to saying. What we should do is follow the Australian model, because the Australian model, they used to send people off to, I think it was an island off somewhere, Indonesia, I believe it was. And basically, this was where they got sent. This was the place where they were meant to start their new lives in this camp. And this would be where they would go to live pretty much from then on. And of course, the Rwanda policy is exactly the same, except a lot of people are really missing one of the key things in this Rwanda policy, that Rwanda, according to the government's own details, is actually allowed to send its refugees to the UK. This is not a one-way process. And a lot of people seem to, especially on the right, seem to have ignored that bit of process. In fact, the Rwandan government has actually brought up a couple of times that the UK government has so far refused to accept any of its refugees. I wonder why. But this policy is just going to go nowhere. And honestly, it should be ended before it even begins, because we've got historical precedent. These types of policies do not end well and normally end up being humanitarian hellholes. Just look at what happened to the Australian version of this, and of course, the Israel one that also decided to do this as well. They did not end well. And those policies themselves were eventually removed after it became very clear that there were massive, massive human rights violations and crimes being committed, not only not by the inmates of these asylum, shall we say, centers, but by the people who were running the center. So, yeah, this policy is not going to end well. And it shows today that we've had revelations after a charity has put in a Freedom of Information Request Act today that's just come out very recently, that officials brought up concerns to Priti Patel, to the Home Office, that say, okay, we have serious reservations about this policy. We do not think it's going to go well. But it just goes to show you the level of how desperate Priti Patel was desperate to get this policy through. So before we go into reading this article and some of the Freedom of Information request stuff that it's uncovered, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a link where you can buy me coffee, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. So on we go over to The Guardian with their story on this. With UK's officials raised concerns over the Rwanda policy documents show. The Home Office pushed through its policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda despite repeated concerns from UK government officials. It has emerged from documents submitted to a High Court hearing. The government's disclosed the documents, which raised numerous concerns about the Rwanda plans, ahead of a full hearing later this year into the lawfulness of this policy. Claimants in the legal action include charities such as Care for Calais and the Detention Action and the PCS Union, which represent many Home Office staff. And they are working with several individual asylum seekers from countries including Iraq, Sudan, Syria, and Albania, who were threatened with a removal to Rwanda on a flight on the 14th of June, which was grounded after the legal action. Excerpts from this document, which was submitted to the High Court for a preliminary hearing, describe the date and timetable of the full hearing. The government disclosures as part of the case reveal this. On the 10th of February 2021, the UK High Commissioner to Rwanda said the UK should not do a deal with Rwanda because the African country had been accused of recruiting refugees to conduct armed operations in neighboring countries. I think that's a big concern. That's a very, very big concern. That's the first time I've heard that. So certainly very, very concerning that they are recruiting refugees to carry out armed operations in neighboring countries. I think that's quite concerning. On the 18th of February 2021, Rwanda was identified as one of 14 countries accused of pressing substantial issues in relation to asylum systems and human rights. Rwanda received an amber/red rating from the government owing to significant human rights concerns. So even our own government is identifying here that there are significant problems with the Rwanda's human rights record, despite, of course, what conservatives and other people in the government have been saying about Rwanda very recently. A Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office memo dated the 20th of May 2021 urged Number 10 to get involved with the Rwanda deal owing to significant human rights concerns. Another internal memo criticized the, quote, limited evidence about whether these proposals will be a sufficient deterrent for those seeking to enter the UK illegally. And another detailed internal memo appears to be dated of the 12th of April 2022, the day before a memorandum of understanding was signed between the UK and Rwanda, stated that the, quote, fraud risk is very high. And in the deal, because the UK was paying so much money upfront to Rwanda. So all this money that we're, again, giving to go to make sure that Rwanda looks after these refugees, our own government says, look, the risk of fraud is very high. Yeah, and already money has been paid to them. So already, where's this money gone? How's it been spent? It's probably been, shall we say, squirreled away in a bank account somewhere by some officials. That's not too surprising to see that happened, considering that, again, according to an own internal memorandum of fraud risk is very high. The document from the day of the memorandum was signed and stated that the first group of asylum seekers due to be flown to Rwanda could, quote, test Rwanda's refugee discrimination process. So that's even more worrying that they were just going to go, yeah, these first lot will test to see how discriminatory they really are. Oh, yeah, wonderful, wonderful, guys. Just, use people as test subjects just to see how discriminatory this process that they're going to be. Yeah, you can see how bad this policy is just going to get. And the final one, when the UK government conducted an independent assessment of Rwanda's human rights record, the Home Office showed it to Rwanda to comment on the final draft, and they allowed officials to suggest amendments. Sure, Rhonda, here's your really bad human rights record. Would you like to make any amendments to it? This is going to be an awful. If this honestly is allowed to go through and continue, we're going to see the exact same things happened which we saw in the Israel plan, in the Australia plan, where these places became absolute humanitarian nightmare zones. Paul O'Connor, the head of bargaining at the PCS union, said that the revelations at today's hearing are extraordinary. They paint a picture of a Home Secretary desperate to railroad through this policy through, even in the face of serious reservations about being raised by senior departmental officials. And the documents before the human rights courts indicate that the Home Secretary is well aware of the human rights violations in Rwanda. He added, the government needs to abandon this policy if it is to retain a single shred of credibility that it takes as a legal obligations seriously. Claire Moser, the founder of Care for Calais, said that the serious concerns were readily internally known about the Rwanda policy, and the Home Secretary has complete disregard for people's lives who have already experienced unimaginable trauma. The document submitted on behalf of the Home Office said that there was strong public interest in the listing of this case and the expediency and the permanent and the permitting of the government to put in effect a policy intended to deter illegal, unnecessary, and dangerous journeys. Again, if the government wants to, quote, deter these legal journeys, the answer has already been made pretty crystal clear. Just make there a safe route. And if people say, oh, that's impossible, then why did the Ukrainians, who have got fast tracked and all their stuff, and they've had sort of safe routes, even though again that system has been far from perfect, why have they been treated so much differently? And don't get me wrong, yes, they've been treated sort of a lot better, but they haven't been treated, shall we say, in a very, shall we say, 5-star rating. It's maybe less than 1 star, and I'm very hesitant to even offer it that type of rating, given that again I know people in sort of JCI Ukraine, and I've heard some of their horror stories already on this. So yeah, um, this policy, I hope it just dies a death. We should not be pursuing this policy. The obvious problems are there for all to see. I mean, straight away, we should not be doing this policy. And if I were a Labour MP, every time this comes up, I will be bringing up this to Priti Patel, to the government. How are you going to ensure that these asylum seekers we send are not drafted forcefully into military action against Rwanda's neighbors? How are you guaranteeing that that is not going to happen? And quite frankly, you know, they will not be able to answer it. That's the attack pattern that I would be using if I was a Labour MP. But yeah, it just goes to show you what we've been saying right from the very beginning of this policy first coming out. It is going to be an absolute disaster. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.